Hey, so just wanted to give you a heads up here. The following video is going to contain discussions of abuse, suicide, and other related issues. I'll add a list of more detailed trigger or content warnings in the description below. Now, Higurashi no Naku ni is a pretty long-running series. It started in the early 2000s as a sound novel. Recently, though, a sequel to the original Higurashi came out, referred to as Higurashi Gou, and then was followed by a new season that's currently airing called Higurashi Sotsu. It's been pretty interesting. It's not perfect, but for a lot of very long-running fans, I myself have been following Higurashi since probably around 2007 or 8. It is a major breath of fresh air to look at the original series in the light that the new seasons have brought into it. But, and this is a big but, there has been discourse about the decisions made and the character angles taken in this most recent season. What I am here to talk about is the myth of the ideal victim. Way back in the 1980s here, a man by the name of Nils Christie put out an essay called The Ideal Victim. He discusses several topics in this, but he starts it with a very good question. What characterizes, at the social level, the ideal victim? The ideal victim being essentially a person that is, in his words, most readily given the complete and legitimate status of being a victim. The ideal victim is, in his use of the term, a sort of public status in the same type and level of abstraction as that, for example, of a hero or a traitor. It's difficult to count ideal victims just as it is difficult to count heroes, but they can be exemplified. This is a very interesting way to broach the question of victimhood, survivorship, and other related issues in response to topics of trauma. I think that Higurashi, both its original series and now its successors, as well as even Umineko, another major When They Cry title that many of the Higurashi fans are quite aware of, do very well in their exploration and their breakdown of the ideal victim. While Higurashi is filled with many characters who experience different levels of trauma, whether you're looking at Keiichi, who has been pushed to such a level of stress that he has abused other children in his neighborhood and ended up in a position of severe self-loathing because of it, or Shion, who has been, by and large, ostracized from her family in her very town, abused by her grandmother at the eyes of every one of her family members, and has dealt with severe levels of grief and self-destruction. Looking at Reina, who has background of abusive divorce, where she has blamed herself heavily, led to diagnosed PTSD in the novel itself, and severe self-harm and even suicide attempts. But no two characters of the main cast go so deeply into the reigns of trauma as Satoko Hojo and Rika Furuderu. As a side note, Takano, Mio Takano, also an excellent exploration of victimhood and the ideal victim and how she plays a part in that, but I'm primarily wanting to focus on Rika and Satoko for very good reasons as we move forward. Early on in the series, we are introduced to Rika and Satoko. The first two arcs primarily are dealing with Keiichi and Reina, and then moving on to dealing more with Mion and her twin sister Shion, in addition to Keiichi and the, at this point, unseen older brother of Satoko. It is at this point, though, in the third arc, that we are introduced to the shadow, the specter that is the trauma of Satoko Hojo. Now, Nils Christie actually gave some very good characteristics of what he felt exemplified the ideal victim. These things that effectively define whether or not someone will be seen as a victim. He calls an ideal victim as someone who is weak, blameless, carrying out a noble task, that they have been harmed by malign forces or actors, but These forces cannot be specifically identified. With all of this in mind, it also needs to be that the victim themselves can effectively claim victim status, at least having some level of power in their community that they can actually claim that identity. Broadly, at first glance, as seen in the third arc of Higurashi Tatagoroshi, it seems that Satoko should somewhat meet these. She is weak. She's an 11-year-old little girl. She can't do much about her situation. From the outside looking in, it seems like she'd be blameless. After all, what child deserves to be abused? And, it's bad. It's wrong. No one would want that to happen to a kid. However, Satoko's abuse continues. The example that Nils Christie gave when he was defining an ideal victim was essentially, imagine a little old lady who's walking home in the daytime, not through alleyways on the regular street where plenty of other people should be. She's walking home from taking care of her sick sister, because of course she's only out because she's doing an important, noble task. She isn't out at some dangerous time of day. She isn't needlessly endangering herself. And then imagine someone coming out and trying to rob her. Someone who bonks her on the head with the butt of his knife. And imagine it's a drug user or someone who's stealing her money for other nefarious deeds. This culprit is no longer a person with their own needs or reasons for committing this. They are, as described by Nils Christie, a malign force, an actor, a bad actor of malign forces. The thing is, though, it's very general. You don't really know enough about this guy. You don't know how he's gotten involved in this. All you know is that he's some guy. He's completely unrelated to this woman. This woman, nothing about her personality, nothing about who she is or what she's doing has defined why she's being attacked. There's nothing that has led her to become a victim from a personal standpoint. It is random chance that has caused this event. Beyond that, she survives, and because of her ability to uphold these other things, she is a respected old woman in the community. She can claim victim status, and she becomes the ideal victim. In the same way that if someone had come in and saved her, they would be presented as a hero. With that in mind, I would describe Satoko's situation. Now, what you know in episode 3 isn't the full story, but here's the basics. Satoko Hojo is 11 years old in 1983. 3 years ago, her parents died. 2 years ago, Rika's parents died. Last year, her aunt who was abusing her died, and her brother, who had also been abused, disappeared. Back when her parents were still alive, Satoko called the child welfare services on her stepfather at the time. He was not actually abusing her. Effectively, one from the outside could look at this as a situation of the boy who cried wolf. Because of that incident, future calls made about Satoko to the Child Welfare Committee were seen as less important. They didn't hold them in such high regard. They were more concerned about them being potential lies or situations where Satoko was lying about being actively abused. Beyond that, Satoko is also seen as someone who would often cry for her brother to help her, was unable to defend herself, and continued to act in rash and selfish ways that essentially made her life harder. It made it more likely for her aunt to lash out and abuse her because she questioned her aunt, because she said things in response to her aunt. This wasn't someone who didn't know her that was hurting her. This is someone who knew her and was angry at her. This is her caretaker, and she was showing face to her caretaker. Important beyond that, the village at large doesn't like Satoko. They don't like anyone with the last name Hojo, like her aunt and her uncle do. This is because her father, stepfather, the fourth one, had supported the dam being built in the village, which would have flooded the village and allowed no one to live there anymore. He wanted the money that they would get out of it so he can move out of the poverty that they had in the village. However, the village at large disagreed with the dam. The Hojo family became a scapegoat, and the children of the Hojo family were seen as bad apples, as bad blood, after all. If someone's unlucky enough to be born a Hojo, even if it's just by name, they may as well deserve the bad luck they get. So with all of that in mind, while someone immediately looking in, like Satoko's friends, can easily see that she is a victim who is in need of help, that she's a person, an individual, who is in desperate need, the ideal victim is a societal question that is presented over individuality and over need. Since the culprit is an individual person that's related to her, they can't easily cast them away, they can't easily scapegoat them in the way that the Hojo family was. Because Satoko has arguably brought this trouble onto herself, it's not good, she's not blameless, there's nothing noble about helping Satoko. Her and her own situation, the only noble thing would be is to be silent and deal with it. This is a major issue that comes up throughout Higurashi and comes to a head in its 7th arc, Minagaroshi Massacre. The second half of the story gives us many of the answers that we've been looking for through introducing the true main character of the series, that being Rika Furude, Satoko's best friend. While in the first half of the series we aren't given much of her interiority or much information about who she is as a person, we know from the 3rd arc that it deeply impacts her that Satoko's uncle has returned. Rika and Satoko lived together in the aftermath of Satoko's only living guardian leaving the town, and their parents both being dead. The two of them are closer than family could ever be, but Rika is also a weak 11-year-old child. She doesn't have the power that is needed to end these things, to make the Child Welfare Service intervene, to make the police arrest Satoko's abusive family. She can't do that. She's a child. But what Rika is an ideal victim. Going through that whole discussion of what made Satoko not an ideal victim is all of the reasons that Rika is the ideal victim. As we find out, the reason that these loops, that these different realities happening before us are the way they are, is because Rika Furude dies in every single one. The individual fact that brings all of them together as an absolute and as a terrifying reality that Rika desperately wants to avoid. After all, Rika is blameless in her death. She's gone through 100 years of these loops that she experiences, 100 years of fragments. Regardless of what she does, she dies. There's nothing she is doing, she realizes, at a personal level that is causing her death. Weak, blameless, she's carrying out a noble task as well. Because as it turns out, if Rika dies, the whole village dies. As we saw in the 3rd arc, what seems to be a gas leak that kills everyone overnight. This is inherently connected to her own death. In seeking her own survival, it becomes not selfish, not imposing upon others, but instead inherently noble, because to save herself is to save her home, to save her friends, to save the village. Once we finally discover what it is that's killing Rika, we realize it can't really be specifically or easily identified. We know that there's a person who is the person that's killing Rika by dissecting her, but Takano isn't doing this as an individual. She's a part of a government task force. She's aided by militant bodyguards who carry out unfortunate deeds in the name of what they're doing. But all of them distance themselves from the idea that they are actually doing this for the sake of hurting people. Takano has unsavory wants, but much of those are because she's been so heavily manipulated by the task force that she is working with, and because she herself has a severe deal of her own personal trauma. Because of that, and because we are so intimately familiarized with Takano, we realize that this isn't about her. This isn't about any individual. There's many bad actors, and there's a malign force that is defeated in the end, that being essentially the government task force that was sent out, and they are effectively ousted from their power. But none of it's Rika's fault. It's nothing to do with her personally. It has nothing to do with her personality. It's the fact that she was born as being special, the very thing that lets her loop, that leads her to die. Because of that, she continues to be the ideal victim. Because at the end of the day, while there's people to blame for her suffering, it's easy to hate the things that cause her pain. And it's easy to dismiss it and to say, this is a wrong. This is objectively bad. The suffering of this girl is unnecessary. Because it's not her aunt. It's not her uncle who came back to town. It's not because Rika was saying things about people or talking back to the adults in her life. In fact, Rika is doted upon by the entire elderly population of the town. Despite her being 11, people listened to her. They let her live on her own, even with her dead parents. She essentially has the power and the knowledge to claim that victimhood, to claim the sometimes pity, sometimes concern that people have for Rika, because it's the only way that she can get people to listen to her ultimately. Because she's a victim, people will help her. Because she is an orphan, she is weak, she is in need of, she is deserving of this aid. In reality, she's mentally 111 years old, but she presents a self that is ideal to the people around her, even though deep down she is bitter and angry about what happens to Satoko and herself and her friends over and over and over again. Why is it that Satoko isn't the ideal victim in this? Because, like, she's an orphan, you know? She has problems, but it's not like helping her is that noble. After all, in the 7th arc where they save her, it's a lot of work. They have to convince the whole town. They have to confront the town elders and basically threaten and fight just to have Satoko's problems be acknowledged. It's in the aftermath of that Rika feels like she can talk to her friends about her problems, but, I mean, that's mostly because the other people were helping Satoko. Like, it's not like Satoko was doing anything to help herself either, right? She asks for help in the end, but, you know, if she just tried harder or didn't talk back or was better at cleaning, was more mature, was smarter, was easier, wasn't so loud and annoying, didn't cause so many pranks, didn't cry so easily, didn't do better. You know? Yeah, it is her fault, isn't it? After all, if I was in that situation, I'd definitely deal with it. Like, look at what she did to her poor older brother. He had to throw himself in front of her so many times. Like, just look at that. Look at this. He is getting abused just because of Satoko. His life is harder because Satoko is there. I mean, right. Why was she even born? Why didn't her mom just get an abortion? Oh, wait. Her mom did say that to her. Oh, wait. Between 4 different stepfathers, she was being abused by them, just not the most recent one. All by the age of 8, as it turns out. That's when she thought her parents were going to kill her. That's when she accidentally killed her own parents, under the effects of the Hinamizawa syndrome. It's sad. The thing is, no one knows just what Satoko has had on her mind, just what she has gone through, except for herself. Most people don't know what her mom said to her about wishing that she hadn't been born and saying it would have been better if she hadn't been. Most people don't know, outside of Satoshi, that Satoko was inadvertently merging all of her stepfathers into one person because she was 8 she was so young that she literally could no longer tell them apart, because the time passed so quickly and her memory was so distorted by being so young and so traumatized. So if we're to blame Satoko for being a bad victim, for someone who's brought these things onto herself somehow, for it being her fault that all of the adults in her life have responded to her actions with violence and disdain, Satoshi, her brother, he should be an ideal victim, right? I mean, he does everything right. He's weak, but he still tries, and it's really not his fault that his sister is, like, causing this violence against them. The fact that he always has to defend her and be, like, the lone person that she trusts for most of their young life. When their aunt is abusing them, he's the one that throws himself in front of them. If she didn't cause these fights, everything would be fine. He gets along fine with his aunt, despite how cruel she is. He can deal with it. He's just old enough. He's just exhausted. He doesn't deserve this. He is carrying out a noble task, ultimately. Like, in protecting his sister, he is only becoming a victim because he wants her to be safe. When you're looking at kind of like it might not be like bad actors or malign forces that are hurting him. They can be very specifically identified, but in this kind of constraint, you could frame it in the lens of he's only suffering and he's only become a victim because of what other people are doing. This isn't related back to him as a person. Nothing about his personality is causing abuse towards him outside of his want to be a good person. Can Satoshi claim victim status? Why is it that he disappeared, or that he was still being abused, if he's the ideal victim in this? If he's, just like Rika and being so noble and good? It's because the concept of the ideal victim is created by the society you live in. As I mentioned earlier, the Hojo stepdad basically came in and he wanted the stam that the whole rest of the village didn't want. So the Hojo family became the perfect scapegoat, a force, a malign, hateful, bad actor that deserved to be put down and fought against to get everyone on the village's side. He was the perfect framework to fight them. So because of that, the rest of the village came to openly hate the Hojo kids as well. And it's not so simple as that. It's not like everyone hates them. It's just they feel like they have to push them away. They can't afford to be nice because the village elders might see you. They might get mad at you because there's all these terrible rumors. Because of that, Satoshi isn't an ideal victim. And because of that, we realize there was no way for Satoko to be an ideal victim herself. There was no way to stop what was happening to her. There was never a way for her to claim proper victimhood that would make society look at her as someone who deserved to be saved. And you know what? She kind of knows that. And that's why in the final arc, she's desperately trying to tell them that she doesn't need help because she's terrified at pity, and she's terrified at the way that people look at her like she can't do anything on her own. She's able to ask for help in the end because it's Rika on the other end of the line, the person that's like her, the orphan, the one in desperate need of help. But in many ways, the only reason that Satoko can get out of it is because the ideal victimhood that Rika has, she tries to pass it on to Satoko in some ways. By keeping Satoko with her at all times, she's able to keep her in this kind of protective bubble from the rest of the village. So even if they might have disdain or they might try to ostracize Satoko, as long as Rika's there, she can stop it just by existing. So Higurashi ends, just like that. It's not necessarily a story about who's a good victim and who's a bad victim. In fact, it's actually a story about how there is no such thing. That everyone deserves to be safe, that everyone deserves to forgive themselves and move on from the bad things that they've done. Satoko has killed her own parents. She feels like she is the one to blame for her brother's disappearance, and that she is to blame for her own struggles and problems that people have to save her from. But she shouldn't have to redeem herself. She shouldn't have to work for that. All she needs to do is want to grow and change herself into the person she most wants to be. And Rika's finally able to escape her 100-year cycle, the purgatory that she's lived in for her entire life. And she does it by also helping Satoko escape. While Minagaroshi, the one where they save Satoko from her uncle, is not the final arc, it is the arc that gives Rika the determination that she needs to succeed in the final story. All that's just a setup, though. That's not even why I came here today. Way back, 2020, and at the beginning of this video, I mentioned Higurashi no Naku Koro ni Go. It was introduced to us as, just a remake. It was not a remake. And for all of its faults, it would turn out to be a very interesting sequel that delves into, at first, seemingly just Rika and what she did after she was able to leave Hinamizawa. Eventually it reveals that Satoko is the one who is behind these now repeating loops that Rika has been going through. Her very best friend, the person she's always been closest to, her fellow victim, is the person that has put Rika through this. And so as to explain to us why Satoko has done these things, we were taken through an arc called Tatagoroshi. It is exploring how victimization and re-victimization takes its hold in the world at large. In the arc itself, in Tatagoroshi, Rika actually goes out of her way to make sure that the village elders say all of the feuds from the original Dam War are ended, so that Satoko is freed from the curse. Satoko also is no longer infected by the Hinamizawa syndrome, which makes Rika feel as if they're able to leave the village. At a baseline factor, it seems like Satoko's problems are solved. After all, her uncle isn't coming back to town, she lives with Rika, she is happy with Rika even when they're studying together. And the town has now officially accepted Satoko as one of them, no longer ostracizing her at an inherent level. It would seem that all of the roots of her trauma no longer exist. Her status as a bad victim is erased. She no longer has any victimhood at all, in fact, you could say. She has trauma, but she is no longer a person who is being victimized. She is not an ideal victim still, but as far as Hinamizawa is concerned, she doesn't need to be. With this information in mind, where do we find ourselves, though? Knowing that Rika makes such an ideal victim and Satoko makes such a poor victim by comparison at a societal level, what does this tell us about what Higurashi is doing with victimhood and trauma? While much of what we see in the original Higurashi, in my opinion, is trying to show us the dichotomy between an ideal victim and those who fail to achieve that status, it further goes in attempting to break down that wall. What makes Satoko into the opposite of an ideal victim is primarily societal understandings. In the end, can't you argue that it is a noble thing to save Satoko? Because at a base level, that is the right thing to do. It isn't fair to leave anyone to suffer. Higurashi as a whole believes that no one should ever be left out. When you're playing those games of Old Maid with the Joker versus the version that Rika describes where they've taken out a single card, she describes adding that card back in, an ending where nobody's left out. Not even Takano. Even a villain like Takano can be given a life of her own. The same goes for Satoko. I did mention Higurashi Gou, and that is where I feel the exploration of the ideal victim goes further. I'll leave this video as it stands for now, but in the next I'd like to explore just how ideal victimhood continues as you age, and the way by which trauma can complicate your ability to achieve outside of your childhood memories.